Good evening and welcome to the New School. My name is Karen Kooni. I run the Veralis Center for Art and Politics here at the New School, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this evening and to the 11th annual Distinguished Critic Lecture presented in collaboration and by AICA, the Association of International Art Critics, and its American chapter. The talk is delivered by Paul Chot Smith, who is an Associate Curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian Institution in DC. The title of Paul Chot Smith's talk is 13 Months in America. And I think it is important to recognize that the America we're occupying tonight on this island, in this building, is land whose first inhabitants were Lenape Indians. Given that AICA is an association of art critics, it is interesting to me to consider the so-called land acknowledgement or territorial acknowledgement, which I just tried to do, as another form of writing. In fact, recognizing our relationship to space and place is sometimes called land writing with a W, and is, as Indigenous scholar Karen Recollet said, a, quote, ancient Indigenous practice that flows into the future. Writing with and on land suddenly expands the context and certainly the consequences of our writing practices enormously, and I am deeply honored that Paul Chot Smith is here to guide us through an expanded notion of what writing in America and on America means at this moment. It's particularly gratifying to have him here, since Paul is also a member of the nominating circle of the biennial Veralis Center Prize for Art and Politics. And his presentation, in addition, in a way, caps our 18-month research initiative entitled Indigenous New York, which was developed in collaboration with artists Alan Michelson and Jackson Paulus. Thank you, Paul. Before we hear from him, I'd like to take a moment and thank AICA, its staff and board, for many years of collaboration. I think it's fair to say that the partnership between AICA and the Veralis Center has grown stronger with every lecture. For instance, we're now collaborating on the Veralis New School Art Collection Writing Awards, where the student winners of art critical texts receive professional mentoring by an AICA member, most recently Lily Way. At the Veralis Center, I'd like to thank the indispensable team of Programs Manager Emily Donnelly and Curator Amanda Palmer. And I would also like the members of the advisory committee that support our work in many different ways. But now let's hear it from Amai Wallach, my dear colleague, filmmaker, critic, writer, past president of AICA, and the expert who will now expertly introduce Paul Chot Smith. Thanks.
Welcome, everyone. I think we have an extraordinary treat in store here. AICA, I just want to tell you, the International Art Critics Association, USA, is one of 64 member nations. It was formed after World War II when all kinds of discourse needed to be rehabilitated, and art criticism was seen as a defense of art and a defense of thought and a defense of writing, and it has continued that way to this day. We're the largest chapter in the US with 400 members. Our presidents are in this room. They are Susan Harris and Judith Stein. Excuse me. This is our 11th annual AICA Distinguished Critics Lecture, and this year the New School let us know that they would like us to choose someone in connection with their indigenous New York enterprise that they were engaged in. And so I was reading an awful lot of work by very interesting, provocative, important American Indian writers. And I have to say that Paul Chot Smith stood out remarkably. The AICA Distinguished Critic speech is about showing what we think is excellence, and a lot of what we think of as excellence is having an individual voice. There are so many ways to deal with the very, very complex issues of art, politics, society that we have to deal with, but to find an individual way to do it is the most difficult part. And I think that Paul Chaat Smith has the voice of a novelist, of a Jenny Egan or a Sherman Alexie or a Jeffrey Eugenides or a Michael Chabon or Sadie Smith. So I'll just say that. And in that interest, let me just read a little bit of what he said in his book, Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong. The title says it all anyway. He's talking about just before all of the Indian protests in the 60s and the 70s. He says, "We were in those days losers. We were England before the Beatles, Russia before Gorbachev. Indians were history, an elementary school homework. Tedious pictures from a family vacation." And then, following the protests, they are visions of a personal universe of sorts, a recruiting brochure for what might have been, provoking the same kind of wonder as Tinkers and home movies from the 1964 World's Fair. How could we have ever been so naive, so young, so optimistic, so wrong? They each predicted a future that never arrived. Here he is, Paul Chaat Smith.
God, what a beautiful room this is. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Amai. Thank you, Ika, and the New School and the Vera List Center. Well, part of me is always going to regard my selection for this lecture as a stupendous and hilarious mistake. The rest of me couldn't care less how it happened. I'm just so grateful it did. All of which is to say, I'm just very pleased to be with you tonight. In the old days, no one grew up wishing to be an art critic. Holland and Lucy and Roberta and Peter say they all just kind of fell into it. I guess it's different now, but for those of us from the 20th century, before bartenders curated drinks, before glowing rectangles conquered the world, and before the interwebs encouraged millions to practice cultural criticism without a license, before all those awful things came to pass, few vocations were as obscure as art criticism. Some quick biography: both parents from Oklahoma, born at the dawn of the Great Depression. Mom, the oldest daughter in a large family of Comanche Indians. She grew up in Lawton at the parsonage of her dad's church. He was a Dutch Reform minister. My father's from Dibble, not too far from Chickasha, raised on a farm. That side of the family was white, though many years later, my two sisters and I would learn Grandma Smith was actually an enrolled Choctaw Indian, and the farm where we spent summers and holidays was allotted Choctaw land. But let's be clear, that side of the family were as white as could be. Once married, my parents couldn't get out of Oklahoma fast enough, and for this reason, my sisters and I were all born in the Texas Panhandle. Even Texas was an improvement. We don't remember any of that, since we soon moved to Ithaca, where Dad got his doctorate in education. He worked fast, no memories there either. We were still very young. In the early 1960s, we moved to College Park, Maryland. Clotis was now an agriculture professor and soon an administrator at the University of Maryland. Paula taught second grade. College Park is suburban DC and crucially home to a large research university. I was a terrible student with the grades to prove it, but had access to another kind of education. Bertolucci movies and lectures by Black Panthers and famous scientists, and anti-Vietnam War demonstrations on campus, and a world capital 20 minutes away. My family toured the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum and marveled at fuzzy images on the video phone at National Geographic. As I got older, I read Ramparts and the New Republic, even had my own subscription to the Washington Post. By my teenage years, I had all the raw ingredients a future critic needs. I was alienated, bored yet curious, moody and pretentious. And this is so important. I was middle class. Aren't all the best critics from the middle class? I knew in my bones what all teenagers know. There was something deeply wrong about the world. My days felt like slowly burning embers, fueling endless dissatisfaction. There was something else, too. I was growing up in a white suburb, yet I wasn't exactly white. Fire meet gasoline. Being an Indian who wasn't sure he was really Indian was my terrible secret and shame for years and years. It didn't seem to matter that I was close to my Comanche relatives. I saw them several times a year, or that my grandfather's church was so hardcore indigenous it even had a Comanche-only language service. It wasn't like I was adopted out and had no connection with Indians. It was that somehow I decided the connection wasn't what it was supposed to be. I can't explain when or why, but eventually it made sense to write about it. This saved my life, yet it never felt brave. It felt necessary. I wanted to figure things out, and I knew I was too lazy to write unless the stakes, especially the emotional stakes, were raised into the stratosphere. Parenthetically, one thing I love about being a critic is that being self-involved doesn't count against you. Authenticity and its discontents would become my great theme. But turning angst into what I later named the suburban Comanche way of knowledge would come much later. After just barely graduating high school, I went to college at a place in Ohio called Antioch. Famous alums Rod Serling, Coretta Scott King. The reason I applied is because it was said to be the most radical college in the land. And even more importantly, they didn't give grades. Everything was pass and fail. It turns out I was no better a student there than I was in grades K through 12. The college was designed for upper middle class kids who went to excellent high schools or even prep schools, whose parents listened to classical music and read John Cheever. My schools were mediocre, and my parents never heard of John Cheever. Antioch didn't work for me, except for this. They insisted all students must have experience in the real world, so half the time you were off somewhere outside of Yellow Springs on an internship. And one day a listing appeared for the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee in Sioux Falls, created to provide legal assistance to people on trial for the armed occupation at Wounded Knee, which happened just a year earlier. That's how I ended up being in the Indian movement for the next 5 years. I'm embarrassed to admit that for a long time, I left out or downplayed the Antioch connection, letting people believe perhaps I just suddenly left home in the middle of the night and rode a boxcar out west. Remember, I had lots of angst about being middle class too. However, the early rumblings of the Indian movement and my own blossoming identity crisis have been pushing me towards Sioux Falls for years. I'd read Von Deloria's Custer Died for Your Sins. I had a Red Power bumper sticker on my bedroom window threatening the mean streets of College Park Woods. I'd wear beaded moccasins in public now and then. And the thing is, even if I found my own way to aim, I'm not sure I would have stayed without the Antioch internship. I arrived in Sioux Falls in August 1974. I was 19. The Wounded Knee Legal Defense Committee, like the shambolic American Indian movement itself, was just nuts. The first thing new arrivals did was sign up for food stamps. You could also join organized shoplifting expeditions for clothes and other supplies. That was optional, as was learning how to steal Hertz rentals. It was so easy in those days. Everyone was still buzzing about the full-scale police riot at the Sioux Falls courthouse a few weeks earlier, made national news. Home was a vacant apartment building downtown. We lived there, dozens of us, Indians and lawyers and white friends from around the country. It was slated to become rubble after the trials were over, and you had the feeling a wrecking ball was counting down the minutes. Nixon resigned the week after I showed up. It was all just as fantastic as it sounds. It's hard to explain what I did. The short answer is not much. I wrote a few press releases. Okay, well, there was just one, actually. maybe a fundraising letter. That August, we went to Crow Dog's Paradise on the Rosebud for the Sundance, and a German film crew recorded the whole thing at the insistence of spiritual leader Leonard Crow Dog. I'll tell you this, AIM guys, every last one of them, man, did they love the camera. Mainly, I had the incredible privilege of observing. Years later, when I read about Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, I saw myself in the novelist Robert Stone. He was one of the pranksters, an insider, but always at a certain distance. He was always watching, taking mental notes. He was like a human experiment in quantum mechanics, simultaneously on the bus and off the bus. Sioux Falls was where I first met Jimmy Durham, who had left art school in Switzerland to support AIM. I guess I knew that, but never thought of him as a serious artist until years later when we both lived in New York and people like Klaus Oldenburg would come to his shows. AIM was a slow motion car wreck, and yet the worse it got, the more determined I was to stay. Leonard Cohen wrote a line that perfectly described my politics. I wanted to fight the secret police takeover, but from within the party. Watching it all unfold in real time proved to be a masterclass in criticism. So many questions, so many stories, and all so different than the narratives AIM generated or the ones in the press. It was another world, dark and complicated and dangerous. Wheels within wheels. There were more legal trials in Lincoln, Nebraska, where we all lived on an abandoned Air Force base, and in Rapid City. We opened an office across from the United Nations in New York and held a big conference in Geneva. AIM, we said, was not some dime store protest group in the United States anymore. It was a liberation movement, like the ANC and the PLO and ZANU. By 1977, I was living in San Francisco, publishing a newsletter for the movement's international wing. I was even listed as a member of AIM's Central Committee. Sounds cool, but the movement's support was a shadow of what it had been 4 years earlier. Things went from bad to worse. AIM always had too many national leaders, and perhaps in an effort to reduce that number, one national AIM leader shot another. Both lived, but AIM was dysfunctional and dying. I stayed loyal to the party as long as I could. Then in the spring of 1979, it all came crashing down, and it was finally time to move to New York. Okay, so you guys think the trains are bad now? You have no idea. For me, New York was just as thrilling as the Indian movement. Living here gives your life purpose, even if you have absolutely no freaking concept of what you are doing. I thought of myself as a political exile, which was pretentious even for me. There was no secret police takeover. AIM just fell apart, and I left. I had the usual kinds of jobs. I read page proofs in Carlstadt, New Jersey, shelf books at Mount Sinai Hospital, and later served as a deeply flawed business manager for a magazine about housing activism. I knew none of those situations were going anywhere. I read art reviews in The Voice and The Times, but not as closely as I read their music critics. Even when I started writing art criticism, I didn't think of myself as an art critic. I wrote my first catalog essay in 1987, which arithmetic absurdly claims is 30 years ago. It was for a show at Artist Space called We the People. I told the curator that I didn't really know anything about, and she said, "Don't worry, that's okay." That was the late, great Gene Fisher. The show featured Edgar Heapabirds, Kay Walking Stick, Jean Lamar, Harry Fonseca, Pena Bonita, I think Alan Michelson, Richard Ray Whitman, and others. So that you heard that right. The first curator I wrote for was Gene Fisher. I asked Lucy Lepard, who I also knew at the time, what she thought, and she said, "Go for it." Did I get who those people were and how fortunate I was to know them? I did not. So I told Gene Fisher, yes, I would write something. Back then, I saw myself as a writer, yet curiously, I'd written almost nothing. Does an underground high school newspaper count? There were only 2 issues, so I don't think so. I don't mean published, I mean writing anything besides grocery lists. Despite all available evidence, I felt certain I was a writer, and more importantly, a writer who someday real soon will perhaps actually start writing. It wasn't confidence exactly. It was an inner knowledge that despite the small problem of not actually ever writing, I was potentially better at writing than anything else I'd tried. True, by this time I finally had a good job, but it was for a left-wing foundation whose future prospects were deeply unclear. I wasn't good at much, and since I hadn't failed at writing, I put all my chips on red. The essay for the Artist Space show was called Anandarko Calling, in honor of the Clash. You'll have trouble finding it, which is a good thing. I'm quite generous to my earlier work, as well as my later work, but in 1987, I simply wasn't ready for prime time. Yet there were flashes of something, a handful of good sentences, and I got some nice comments about it. It was just enough to feel like I was starting to become a writer. And I learned that you could be an art critic and not really have to know anything about art. The thing is, in those days, I spent much more time complaining about the Indian movement than thinking about art. There was lots of Mexican beer and shouting in bars about when the hell was somebody going to write the book that tells the truth about the American Indian movement. And that led to somehow finding a collaborator, Robert Warrior, and a publisher, The New Press, who both said, shut up and write the damn thing. I knew I couldn't possibly write that book and keep my full-time job, so in 1990, I left New York for my family's empty vacation house an hour south of DC. Being middle class rules. Most of the narratives about the Indian movement focused on bad things the government did to AIM. This made sense because the government did lots of bad things to AIM. But I wasn't much interested in that. The government did bad things to the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement. It's kind of what they did. The most influential book back then about AIM was called In the Spirit of Crazy Horse by a writer I really liked named Peter Matheson. I could never finish the thing. It went on forever and made one FBI agent into a criminal mastermind who was pulling all kinds of strings in a vast conspiracy. It was about a shootout between AIM people and the FBI in 1975 on the Pine Ridge. And by that time, AIM had been severely weakened by endless legal trials and its own catastrophic mistakes. To most Indians, by then, AIM had become a literal joke, the joke being that AIM stood for assholes and moccasins. AIM wasn't always a joke. It was in its own way like the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies in the early 20th century, a movement that spread like wildfire from the grassroots. The big truth I knew about AIM was that it was heroic, brilliant, stupid, all at the same time. It spoke to Indians across the country who had little in common and channeled their rage against invisibility into worldwide impact. It was a huge mess, more like a motorcycle gang than a political organization, and it disappointed its followers time after time after time. The book would try to capture all that, to place Indians at the center, not as merely victims, while still featuring Nixon administration officials and mainstream Indian leaders as part of the larger story. I was too callow to realize what an incredible score it was to have the legendary Andre Schifrin as our publisher, deeply involved in the book, and how lucky it was that he assigned future publishing star Don Davis as our editor. Writing that book was the hardest thing I've ever done. With the title lifted from Neil Young, the book I kept waiting for others to write was finally published in 1996. Like a hurricane, the Indian movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee did pretty well, but still inexperienced and feeling entitled. It felt disappointing not to get the big reviews in the Times and the Washington Post. This was at the end of the last century, when, believe it or not, dozens of newspapers around the country still reviewed books, some every day. For a writer, having a legit book with glowing reviews that sells and stays in print for decades is like going from coach to business class. Metaphorically, that is. In the real world, the book didn't change the fact I was a college dropout in my 40s, now living in Washington, who was a temporary office worker, and increasingly a writer of art essays. It wasn't all bad. I married my African queen and acquired 2 splendid cats. Art was a sideline, really. Hardly any money, but I loved being published. One of my essays, my first manifesto, made the cover of C Magazine, a Canadian art monthly, and I drove all the way out to Rockville to buy a copy at the White Flint Borders. I had found a way to write for exhibition catalogs, which was this: write about the things that were tormenting me the most, add some jokes, then throw in a few paragraphs about the artist and her work. If the sentences are good enough, if the ideas are compelling, nobody cares about what it was supposed to be about. It's a trick that might even get you on the cover of a magazine. Spent lots of the 1990s in Canada. Sure, it's cold and easily dismissed as the United States on decaf. But at the end of the 20th century, the great white North was also the center of cutting-edge Indian art. Lots of funding, lots of exhibitions, lots of talent. They have this place in the Rockies called Banff Center for the Arts, where they put you up for months at a time. The bad news was that the exchange rate was terrible. I will not endorse the widely held view that Canadians are cheap, but I will note that $250 isn't a lot of money, especially when converted to American dollars, and especially when your bank rips you off with some bogus extra fee. Sometimes, though, the American bank would send it through as if they were US dollars and not Canadian, and even after I told the American bank teller the Canadian money isn't the same as American. But the bank teller would say, but it says dollars. This is when I first realized the United States was doomed. I journeyed north, always to the least glamorous places. Thunder Bay, not nearly as exciting as it sounds. Brantford, Regina, Brandon, Calgary, Peterborough. It was worth it because the hype was real. The art was fantastic. It was ridiculously easy, too. Lots of government-funded conferences, and after a few years, I felt I knew all the artists in the whole country personally. That was because I did know them all. Canadians were fun, and the parties were great. You could always count on stories about the random moose or bear ending up in somebody's living room. What was tormenting me back then? Same old thing. I spent most of my days debating whether or not I was Indian enough. This has been going on for decades now. How can I be Comanche if I grew up in the suburbs? What do I really know about my people? And so forth. Someone, not me, might have moved to Oklahoma. Maybe Cash, but at least Lawton. They might have studied Comanche history, found an elder, joined the Native American Church. I wasn't wired to do any of those things. So I turned agony into sentences. I wrote of my skepticism about what I named the mandatory retraditionalization craze that was sweeping Turtle Island. Everybody was super spiritual all the time and pretended they always had been. Smudging was so out of control it was dangerous to leave your house. I said, wait a minute, not so fast. I wrote about the famous Sioux holy man Black Elk and reminded everyone he was a lay priest in the Catholic Church his entire life, except when he was touring with Buffalo Bill in Europe. I stole a line from Pauline Kael, who once wrote about a movie's, quote, jukebox Marxism, unquote, and I repurposed that phrase into jukebox spiritualism. That felt amazing. Lots of artists were investigating similar territories, and the coolest thing about being a writer started happening. You find out you're not alone. The people you never met are similarly obsessed and tortured and asking the same questions. And that's a reason you keep going. What I brought to the discourse was a focus how Indian folks, basically every one of us, play a role in the particular kind of racism directed at Indians that's called romanticism. This was, I came to understand, a condition, not a set of incorrect ideas. And Indians had and have agency in that condition. At the very center was my old nemesis, authenticity. That obsession infused how Robert Warrior and I wrote about the Indian movement. We characterized AIM as executing a kind of performance art, always knowing what the press and the public wanted their Indians to be, and subverting, deconstructing, catering to those experiences as the situation warranted. In that sense, the nonfiction journalist-style book about AIM and my art essays were the same project. By 2001, I was at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, or as we never actually called it, the only Indian museum that matters. That's debatable, but you could say it's the only big museum in the country who'd hire someone with just a high school diploma, even if he'd written a book. My last temp job involved an outfit whose clients were big law firms. There were dozens of us in a vast room. We mindlessly printed out documents from hard drives of employees whose company was being sued for what we had no idea. The part I liked best was cutting up cardboard boxes at the end of the shift. At my new job in 2001, I was willingly thrown into the frenzy of building a new museum from scratch and learned some bruising lessons when I curated major sections of the history gallery. The main lesson: exhibitions are hard. After we opened the museum in 2004, a weird thing happened. The museum, aided by a fat grant from the Ford Foundation, decided we should become a player in the international contemporary art world. Our first target was the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennial. That didn't pan out, so we made a big deal of winning collateral status, even though it wasn't all that hard. I remember endlessly explaining to people who couldn't care less about how Venice was structured and how we're officially recognized by the Venice Biennial. I wanted to make sure we were hanging with the right crowd, just like we tried to do in the 1970s with AIM's international campaigns. This time, instead of liberation movements, it was Salah Hassan, Kiki Smith, Emily Jasir. And there was a paradigm-changing exhibition everyone was talking about in those days. I was Documenta 11. Jolene Ricker, one of my mentors on exhibitions and art, was a huge fan of that show, and in fact insisted one day when she was in town that I buy the catalog right then, a huge blue hardcover that must have weighed 10 pounds, which I had to carry all the way from the National Gallery bookshop, and it was 95 degrees in broiling sun and terrible humidity, all the way back to LaFont Plaza. God, that was awful. Document 11 had a huge impact. It showed the value of making an exhibition about something, a lesson in the value and risks of taking a stand, of making bold statements. Deeply controversial at the time, dismissed by many as a leftist agitprop, it eventually achieved recognition as one of the decade's most important projects. I was taken with the show and taken with the show's curator. Do you guys remember that notorious New York Times Magazine celebrity-style feature on Oakley and Weezer? I found it completely mesmerizing, and when I finished reading, I thought, I want to be him. I know what you're thinking, get in line, right? After all, who wouldn't like to be a tall, sharp-dressing Nigerian who knows how to order half dishes that aren't even on the menu? Sadly, over time, I came to realize I had little chance of ever becoming any of those things. So I settled for quoting him in exhibition proposals, along with Foucault and, of course, the Frankfurt School. This sounds terribly careerist for the simple reason it was exactly that. NMAI's international campaign was aimed at creating dialogue and networks and partnerships with key players in the art world. And I knew that's what most Native artists wanted too. During this time, I wrote a piece called Why Are We in Venice, after the 1960s Norman Mailer track called Why Are We in Vietnam? And I gave lots of reasons, but the main reason was that Venice is kind of like the Super Bowl. Actually, it was more like Vietnam. Artists, like athletes, always want to be in the big game. Maybe not all of them, but I guarantee you people like James Loonan, Rebecca Belmore, and Edgar Hippo Birds did not pursue their careers with the goal of spending within a lifetime of Indian-only group shows organized only by Indian curators for Indian audiences. They do not make work for American Indians. They make work for the people of Earth. I subscribed to Artforum and made it my business to know who was who and what was what. That part was fun, knowing to call Rob's store Rob instead of Robert. I liked the challenge and felt I knew how to escape the traps. I was obsessed with positioning the museum with the fast crowd. We hired Venice Wranglers, who told us which venue would give James Luna maximum exposure. It worked, too. Kiki Smith was the other artist in the same building. Olga Viso and Lowry Sims took us seriously and gave us invaluable advice. More amazing teachers. Between 2004 and 2007, I traveled to Venice 5 times, plus Munster and Kassel. Not many half-breed Comanches can say that. We presented James Luna at the 2005 Venice Biennial. We looked closely at Salah Hassan's African projects and modeled our strategy after his. The main problem we faced was avoiding the traps of being either a freak show or a predictable, diversity-focused special pleading. We said, look, we have some kick-ass artists and you guys should stop ignoring us. But no matter how you slice it, argument, some degree, always sounded like it was an argument based on entitlement and exclusion. The James Luna exhibition in 2005 was well received, especially for a collateral exhibit. Art in America would call it the Real American Pavilion in Venice that year. Plus, we got tickets to the Hugo Boss party at the US Pavilion. 6 months later, in December 2005, we returned to Venice with a symposium called Vision, Space, Desire, Global Perspectives, and Cultural Hybridity. You all remember cultural hybridity, right? Featuring, get this, a bunch of Indians and Vasif Kortun, Paulo Herkenhoff, and Rob Storr's own self. Not bad, right? But it wasn't until I was back in 2007 when I realized we had so underestimated the international art world. For one thing, there really is no international art world. It's just a bunch of people doing things. I saw in 2007 that not only were we not invited to the right parties, we didn't even know which ones were the right parties. Cough, Art Forum, cough. And the bigger problem was it sometimes felt like a chase for validation, which became even a bigger problem when some of my comrades argued precisely this. What were we doing? We were so desperate for a seat at the table that we asked for nothing in return. I had no answer for that. Also, Indians, like most peoples of the world, by an overwhelming margin, really don't care for modern and contemporary art, ours or anybody else's. It's always a tough sell. The Venice projects were expensive and deeply unpopular inside the museum, and when the Washington Post wrote about the Venice hotel bills, they weren't popular with NMAI's other constituencies either. The Post quoted somebody saying, "What possible reason could there be for Indians to be in Venice, Italy?" To which we said, "Ha, exactly," which was probably the wrong answer. I was terrible at schmoozing. I never actually introduced myself to Rob's store. Sheldon was at our cocktail party. Did I say, "Yo, Peter, what's up?" I did not. In 2007, I was on a bench in a Venetian park, and Steve McQueen sat down next to me. It was a huge coup to get McQueen to be on our panel during our Agrihipa Birds project, and I was the one who pulled it off, so we'd already met. Steve is as unpretentious and affable as a person you'll ever see. After exchanging pleasantries, mine was usual monosyllabic, he said, "Well, you seem to have a lot on your mind," and politely got up and left. Apparently, I was radiating toxic clouds of anxiety. And I was so mad at myself because I realized later I missed a perfect chance to advise McQueen to take his filmmaking to the next level. Hollywood features. Hear me out, Steve. The whole world needs to see your vision. I could have taken credit for 12 years a slave. When the Ford Grant ended, so did NMAI's worldwide offensive. My Art Forum subscription lapsed. I stopped wondering what Inwezer was having for lunch. I realized that even with all the name dropping and study, the contemporary art world was too fluid and complex to stage interventions that would have lasting impact. And I always had trouble with the overt leftist politics of a scene whose political economy, particularly when the art market exploded, relied on the winners of the very capitalist system the artists and curators railed against. I don't know what I expected them to do, and remember at this point I'm a federal employee working for President Bush, but there was a denial about this that grated on me. At the same time, those years were a blast. So what if we never actually got invited to the coolest parties? The Hugo Boss sponsored thing at Peggy Guggenheim's place wasn't bad for a bunch of amateurs. Back in DC, it was a relief to organize art exhibitions. Fritz Scholder, Indian Not Indian in 2008, followed by Brian Jungen, Strange Comfort. And somewhere around this time, I realized that I no longer spent hours every day thinking about whether I was Indian or not. Probably I'd finally burned out those particular neurons. Kept writing, got pretty good at it too. The whole PCS thing finally took off. Minnesota Press turned my disconnected essays into a book, mostly about insider Indian politics and Indian artists. Sold better than the AIM book. I couldn't believe it when the UK art journal Frieze gave it a nice review. I was floating for a week after that happened. I guess I still have a thing for that crowd. Okay, so 13 months in America. Jesus, feels more like 13 years, right? There were going to be 1,000 words about that night, the night of 11/8, about disbelief and shock and denial, about feeling betrayed by Nate Cohen and Nate Silver and Ezra Klein and David Plouffe and Steve Schmidt, my personal Mount Rushmore of experts who couldn't possibly all be wrong, about the exit polls from Florida that said it was in the bag for HRC, about drunk watching the president-elect at 2 in the morning with the sound off, then switching to John Carpenter's They Live playing on another channel. What it felt like to wake up the next morning and the one after that. In other words, probably not all that different than your 11/9. Steve Schmidt, because he was nominally a Republican, was the one I was most furious about for being wrong, though he also had the best explanation. He said it was, quote, a failure of imagination. I learned that believing something is unimaginable does not make it, in fact, impossible. There was a meeting about the Americans exhibition that next morning. For 2 years, I'd emphasized how the show has to be for all kinds of people. And since that summer, I'd added, quote, even the ones in those red baseball caps with the patriotic slogans. Maybe a time or two, I even said, especially the ones in those red baseball caps. I told my curatorial team we are going to love bomb these people. This ain't going to be a spinach show preaching to the choirs in Tacoma Park and Park Slope. The Indian experience is a supernova and bows to no demographic and no clique, which I believed and still do. But you know, wow, November 9th, I never saw that coming. Patti Smith was once asked if she ever got tired of playing her biggest hit, Because the Night, and she said, no, it's a thrill to give people what they want. I thought a lot about what it means to curate a show on the National Mall with a budget and staff few curators on the planet will ever dream of having. To me, it meant a responsibility to create something equal to the space. You don't book a folk metal trio at Madison Square Garden, even if they're more awesome than you two. You book you too. I began to understand my job differently. If I wasn't making hits, what was the point? The American show is about a paradox that has been normalized, so we barely notice it. And yet once it's pointed out, you can't not see it. The paradox is this. Americans are surrounded by Indian imagery and names from their earliest memories to their final days. It is everywhere, and it whispers to us that we should pay it no mind. The weapon systems, the street where you live, the butter in your pantry, the high school mascot, it's all just the way things are, the way things always have been. Now, of course, audiences like this one tonight have taken some notice and asked if it's appropriate for the middle school to be called the Warriors, or if their college-age kids can wear feathers at Coachella, or is Thanksgiving a bad thing now? And while those are interesting questions, I see them as another deflection. Once busted, the phenomenon of what we've named Indians everywhere still has some tricks up its sleeve. You didn't know paradoxes had sleeves, did you? It's a survival strategy to hide the big truth, which I'm now going to reveal. Indians everywhere is embedded in American life and national consciousness, can never be erased or rectified. It spanned 3 centuries of American life and isn't going anywhere. It can't go anywhere. It's baked in. From Paul Revere to Kanye West, it lives here on our landscapes and highways and kitchens, and most crucially, in our heads. You could rename every sports team with an Indian mascot, every piece of Pentagon hardware, and it would barely make a dent. Now, parenthetically, just because it wouldn't make a dent doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should rename the Washington NFL team and insist the Cleveland Indians retire their hideous mascot, which at this point is more of an embarrassment to the good people of Cleveland than it is to Native Americans. These things should happen. But what I propose is that the bigger and better question is why generation after generation of Americans go through life intimately connected with Indian representations and yet never seem to give it much thought. As Indian Everywhere says, pay it no mind, the Americans exhibition is telling Indians everywhere that your free ride is over, and we're going to finally give this thing the attention it's always deserved. Here's what I've learned in the past 13 months. The United States is almost unfathomably complex and mysterious and full of surprises. And its people, like human beings everywhere, fight with every fiber in their being against the idea they are abstractions that could be summarized and explained. Humans exist to contradict other humans. The last 13 months, if we're paying attention, teach us humility and profound respect for the deep roots of our current situation. In recent weeks, the word reckoning has been everywhere. I've been thinking about that famous James Baldwin quote about American history being more beautiful and terrible than anything that has been written about it. And that maybe we've been hearing what we want to hear in that quote instead of what we should. It's a warning, I think. If the past 13 months have revealed the country's beautiful and terrifying past, that the country's beautiful and terrifying past is present and powerful, no doubt the past being deeply amused that we thought it had gone anywhere, perhaps it's time to look again at the deepest root of all. That is what the exhibition is about, a new examination of the oldest contradiction at the heart of the American National Project. And all that kitsch and renaming of products and streets that we call Indians Everywhere is a visual mapping of a country trying to come to terms with very dark and very hard truths about the United States. But here's the twist. I believe this effort is genuine and sincere, and my exhibition treats it with profound respect. For this project, I leaned heavily on my art school teachers. Scholder's work met viewers inside their own heads, and together the artist and the viewer explored nightmares and monsters. Brian Jungen took cheap patio furniture and built elegant and gently frightening whale skeletons and turned Nike Air Jordans into indigenous masks. Both artists knew the power of the familiar and how to subvert it. Artists, those I've been privileged to curate and the ones whose work I viewed like anyone else, have taught me the immense power of the visual, the awesome force of seeing something familiar as if for the first time, the spooky power of getting inside your own head. 10 years ago, the famously brittle Martha Rossler gifted me with the phrase, totalizing critique. We waited together in a Vancouver parking lot for a shuttle bus that kept not arriving. She was furious. Oh my God, she was so angry. I just heard her present, and I chose that moment to say how brilliant I thought her concept of totalizing critique was. She instantly sized me up as a smartass, which was fair enough, and abruptly made clear she had better things to do than entertain me and moved to a distant section of the asphalt. In other words, it was just about the most perfect Martha Rossler experience you could ever hope for. And yes, later I understood the term goes back to Gramsci or whatever, which really doesn't matter in the least because I never met that guy. But I'll never forget Martha Rossler. I will always be foremost a writer of sentences. Perhaps my most cherished moment in the art scene was when I received equal billing in a show with Kent Monkman, that extraordinary painter of Hudson Valley transcendent canvases, except with lots of naked gay people. My text was in big type, not about his work, not next to his work, but treated equal to his paintings themselves. That was so great. But as writers know better than anyone, sentences can only do so much. The reset I'm looking for with the Americans exhibition can only come from a new way of seeing what is already around us. The words are exhausted, the narrative is broken. The fabulously intricate, accessible, plain-speaking truths of fruit boxes and weapon systems and company logos are the reset. They are the new way of seeing. The visual is the way forward. One last thing. I finally started to realize that I've received an education others would kill for. And I need to appreciate that and respect my teachers and stop thinking of myself as an accidental critic. I didn't fall into anything. I'm their project. Americans, opening in 1 month and 11 days, is in a way the ultimate final exam. I never did very well on those, but you know what? This time I think I'm ready. New York, I love you. Thanks for listening.
And it's going to be extraordinary to see the exhibition. I'm sure that all kinds of people have questions. We have some microphones. You can either come here and use it, I guess, or do we have some to pass around? No, okay, come here and use the microphone. Or no, someone's coming to pass it around. Who has a question? There must be something to ask about this, about the Americans, or I'll start off with a question of my own. Paul, you've written, and I wrote it down, and I was going to read it, but I don't know if I can find it. But you talked about how Europeans never knew anything about what was happening in America. Americans never knew anything about what was happening in Europe, and it was their coming together was the most consequential and profound event in human history, and created the world we know. Do you want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah, this obviously is my insight, and it's slowly getting traction through books like 1491. And there's a way that anything about Indians, somehow it seems to get minimized. So Discovery of the New World, it's about Columbus and the 3 ships and everything else. And the bigger picture is that it doesn't matter if the Vikings were here first, maybe China was here. The point is, in 1492, a highway was built, a permanent highway between these two halves of the world who knew nothing about each other. So I think in the future, just as school kids today learn that human beings originated in Africa, that's a common known fact that people teach. I think in the future, people will start seeing 1492 as the beginning of the world we know now. And that puts Indians at the center of that event, I think, in a profound way. I think we don't appreciate the magnitude of it or how much everything goes back to that point. The discourse is always about tomatoes and foods and whatever. And it was a much, much larger thing than that I think the culture is trying to catch up to.
Yes, a question. Does anybody have anything? Yes.
Here in New York City, we're living in, as my 17-year-old daughter says, a liberal bubble. So I don't really know how accurate things seem from our perspective here. But as Amai and I were chatting in emails, it does seem that, people, it feels different. In New York City, currently there are exhibitions, but the conversation has shifted because I think largely what happened 13 months ago, but it started before now, and I'm asking you because, I feel relatively ignorant in terms of the history and this moving from beyond history to like part of our culture. But I feel that everyone feels the necessity of not just recognizing, but absorbing, the Native American history as part of our own. Maybe that's my own filter, but I guess I would like to know your perspective on that. I mean, does it seem like that's the case outside of this little bubble of liberalism that we live in?
Well, I think most of us live in bubbles of one kind or another. I can't imagine a bluer place in the universe than a conference room of Smithsonian curators. So I don't think it's necessarily that special. I guess what I've been thinking about is this idea of, the idea of, the moral arc of the universe, and the idea of progress in a certain way. And, a lot of the things the country's struggling with now are things that some people thought we had put behind us to some degree. And I think a confluence of different things has just revealed that these are profound differences that have been there, and we chose to imagine they had been resolved in a certain way when they actually weren't. So I think there's opportunity in that, but I think it's really sobering. And I've lately started to think, history isn't really your friend the way you thought it was. History is maybe a friend of me at best, but the idea just like everybody understanding it better somehow will lead to this kumbaya outcome. So I'm not as optimistic about that, but I do feel like there's something about deep respect for the complexity of the United States, and that, these divisions have been there a long time. They're more out in the open now. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. But it was sort of wishful thinking to feel like they weren't as present as they actually are.
I have the microphone. Can I ask a quickie? Hello. Can I ask a quick question?
Please.
I have the impression that you're curating from a different point of view than you would have earlier, that there's less anger involved in your curation and your criticality. And I sense that in general, like there's a lot less angst out there. I'm not sure why, but I was wondering if you could talk to that with regards to your process.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm of the generation that basically came out of the activism of the 70s, and many of those people later were the key architects that pushed for the National Museum of the American Indian. They came out of activism. They weren't museum people or something. And so for that generation, you're still coming in many ways out of the 50s. And the idea is you want to rectify this idea that the US was always a good country, that Indians weren't treated badly, that John Wayne was a hero. And so you're shaped by those things, and you kind of hang on to them long after they're actually true. So what I began to realize in the last several years is most Americans are fine thinking Andrew Jackson was a really bad guy. We just did a show called Nation to Nation, opened a couple of years ago in DC, and overwhelmingly our visitors came in knowing Indian treaties were ripped off Indians, right? Okay, but a key point of that show was to show how in some cases these treaties were magnificent victories, achievements by Indian people that created really good situations for Native people. In fact, we won in some of those times. And because the pendulum had turned so much that everything about Indians is a US screwing over Indian people, you could just feel that visitors were uncomfortable with the idea, and here's a case where a treaty was good, even if it was something that was achieved by Indian people. And what I keep thinking about is, there's many Indian Americans as American Indians. So there's many Dot Indians as Feather Indians, as many Gandhi Indians as Sitting Bull Indians. And of course, I like Indian Americans very much. But we're a tiny percentage of the country. So it doesn't cost anything for someone to say, yeah, Indians really got a bad deal. Take Andrew Jackson off the $20 bill. It doesn't actually mean very much. And it doesn't really advance a deeper sense of what the issues are. So the idea of curating from anger, yelling at people to convince them of things they're already convinced of, just felt pretty empty. I thought it'd be more radical to ask people to consider these things that may look stereotypical, consider them as a phenomenon of profound power that speaks to the central role of Indians in the country and national consciousness. Treat them seriously, treat people seriously. So it just felt played out to be this angry curator with the big truth about Indians.
Yes.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for that. Couple things. First, I noticed the paradox of having no visuals when you said that was the way forward, and I'm wondering if that was intentional, and if you were to use visuals, what you would show. And secondly, you know, the resurgence of white supremacy that we're seeing in this country borrows a lot from this idea of putting ourselves at the center, right, of the story. And the new attack on gay people borrows a lot from the idea of liberation, right, of religious people, like having liberty. So I wonder if you can comment on the fact that as we love-bombed these people, they learned the wrong thing.
Could you say that last part again in terms of gay people and this love bombing thing?
Well, I just think the right has been very adept at twisting our rationales for full dignity into these evil projects of repressing us all over again. Mm-hmm. And they do it in the name of identitarianism. It's like, why can't we be at the center if you can be at the center? It has a logic to it that is very hard to fight. The same thing with the religious liberty, right? I mean, if we get to believe what we want to believe, how can we force this poor baker to embrace gay marriage? So I wonder if you have a comment about that.
Yeah, first I'm pleased that you busted me for talking about how great the visuals are with no visuals. I was hoping somebody would do that. It's partly because I'm lazy and it's so exhausting to do visuals that really work.
That's what I figured.
To write the text. But also, even if it was sort of a reasonably okay selection of slides, it doesn't equal the power of what it is. So congrats on making me look stupid on that one. The part I thought most interesting in your comment is about white supremacy, because that's now a mainstream idea in the world. That's not a fringe idea. And those of us who've been doing this a long time, that was a fringe idea. This immediately identified you as a leftist kook to talk about white supremacy. Even in the left sometimes it was a very controversial idea. So it's become mainstream, and that definitely is a good thing in many ways. And I think people are learning new ways to actually talk about that. Besides rhetoric and guilt shaming, I think race shaming, which I think was a small part of November 9th. At least that's my view. But I'm impressed with people like the San Antonio Spurs coach, Popovich, who's talking about white supremacy in a radically different, accessible way from a position of some power as a white person, where it isn't liberal, platitudes. It's a really rougher, smarter kind of thing. So that's out there in the world. And the other part, it's not like this exhibition is going to change the world. It's not like, people are going to come in with their red baseball caps. Almost all of them will leave pretty much with the same ideas. I want them to have a good time at the show. I'm going to get trashed for that. I feel like it's a transgressive thing to bring people in and have them see different things and be part of this, that I feel like we're winning. I don't know, what can I say? Most things don't really work out, but you still keep trying and seeing what might.
First of all, I want to thank you for the lecture. I really learned a lot about the perspective of the Native American culture. And I'm an artist myself, and I've used certain symbols, Native American symbols in my artwork, and being an artist, visual artist, I noticed that there's very few people, minority people, that I've noticed in the art world, and I wanted to know what you think about how minority artists can navigate the art world.
I think in looking at sort of the people I learned about art with, which were Native artists, you know, in 70s and 80s coming up, you know, they really looked for a sense of solidarity with each other, you know, and they had the same critique of being ignored, their art not taken seriously. So that was a part of what they did. At times, I think that can be limiting because it's always a dilemma. It's like you're now an Indian artist versus an artist, you know, who can make art about the world, right? A white artist gets to make art about anything, well, maybe a few exceptions lately, but somehow is a Native artist. And actually, I'm troubled by this. I think there are too many Native artists whose work is 100% Native all the time. And I know these people, they're my friends. Their spouses are often white, you know, they have nice jobs at universities, they watch TV and drive cars, and they make work that's about this one element of their life that I think becomes problematic. So I don't know, writing is a hard career, but I think art is, in a lot of ways, much more difficult. And so I don't have much insight about how to do that. But I know it's very difficult and remains so.
Me? Hi, Paul.
Hi.
One of the things that I think we had a little sort of interaction with each other in 2006 at Idle Drawer is, and it comes from your observation that maybe it was offhand that, you know, there wasn't that much interest in contemporary art, but I think I've always been wondering how in the Native American community you sort of resolve this kind of very deep, profound respect for traditions and elders and elder makers with, you know, this kind of impulse to move into a larger global contemporary sense. And sometimes the two are put together, which I think confuses the message. And maybe it gets back to what his question, how do you make your way in the art world? And do you think that all the activities that you guys were doing in Venice really make a big difference for Native Americans at this point? Or would they be willing just to sort of go on their own speed and find their own way, you know, through the world and through the marketplace?
It's hard to say. I mean, one thing that happened is, even though NMAI had a big footprint in Venice for those, you know, few years, Indian artists have kept coming to the big international biennials and continue to do that. In a way, it's like NMAI itself. When we opened, we thought very few tribes would open their own museums and cultural centers, and NMAI would have to play a certain role. And in fact, dozens and dozens of tribes have started their own museums. Some of them look at NMAI as a model, some of them couldn't care less. So this impulse of, you know, most artists to want to have an audience, to want to be in the world, and also, importantly, to want to know other artists, learn from other artists' practice. I think most Indians are more like that, and yet there's this brainwashing that says, really, we're so special and different that we should only be in our own crowd and only in our own circumstance. And, you know, it was Jolene Rickard that taught me the term imaginary, that if you're talking about some large, windy thing like the Haudenosaunee or the United States, you know, you're talking about generalizations. You're talking about your particular take on it. So my imaginary is that Indians, you know, in the 19th and 20th centuries have been outward looking and very interested in the world and wanting to be in the world. and not against technology, not against other ideas. That's not something you can prove or disprove. But I think, you know, that's sort of where I come from. And I think with Native artists, it's about having them, you know, be seen not just as equal and legitimate, but also demonstrating that they really do want to be part of the larger art world. And I think we prove that because people are still doing that, absent the funding.
Hi, Paul. Is this on? Have you seen the new Transformers exhibit at the Lower Manhattan National Museum of the American Indian?
I've not seen Transformers yet. I work pretty closely with Kathy. I mean, I'm up to date with what Kathy National, the curator, does, and we talked a few times, but I haven't actually seen it yet.
I was just curious what you thought of it because it's so different than a traditional art exhibit. And everyone here should go see it. It's free in Lower Manhattan, National Museum of the American Indian.
Okay, I would like to know or ask you whether you can talk a little bit more about 1492, which brings the Indian to the center of history, and that this now is a moment where this should become an important talking point.
So when people come into our building in Washington, the most common question is, what's the deal with American Indian? And why don't you say Native American? And some would say it should be indigenous. Why is it American Indian instead of American Indians? And it's been clear in the last 10 or 15 years, people have this idea that to say American Indian is sort of a sort of lightweight slur. It would almost be like using the term Negro when clearly the term African American or black is preferred, or colored or something. And so then you have to give this not that interesting explanation, is that, well, in the US, most Indian people still prefer Indian, but Native American is fine. You can use your tribe, blah, blah, blah. And that's all just to say people are sort of an incredibly basic level because most people don't have Indians in their lives that, you know, except in some places in the country. So there's a diminishment of everything about Indians, and to me, the thing I really thought about in the last several years was, if you didn't know all this stuff about how you're supposed to think about Indians and contact, you just take a globe, and there's an Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. So the Western Hemisphere is the Americas, a tiny bit of Africa, but forget about that. It's half the planet, right? And so what people like me are always asked for, and the museum is asked for, is to give quick cliff notes, 100 words, about the history of half of the world. And I never see a smart museum with 4 big galleries that says, yeah, we do a pretty good job telling you the history of Europe, from the beginning of time, from the ancient beliefs, the folk dances, all the way up to the present, the political situations. That would be ludicrous to think you could do a museum all about Europe or all about Africa or all about Asia. But somehow with Indians, even though, I mean, look at a globe, it's half the world. There's this idea that all this can be explained in a certain way. So for me, 1492 gets at that point because it's like, I always think we're looking at all of this through the wrong end of the telescope, right? And it's making it small. And I know it sounds like something, you know, comes out of being stoned or something, but it is the biggest thing in human history. It really is the thing that changed everything on the planet permanently. And it's gotten reduced to small things. So to me, that's, if that becomes an idea, just as it's not controversial for most people, pretty solid evidence all humans originally came from Africa. Imagine teaching that in 1950. That's like crazy talk. So I'm thinking that's the next thing, and I think there are a lot of possibilities to explore that in a different way, because it really is what binds all of humanity together, is going back to that moment. That's when everything changed.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for the lecture. My question is kind of multifaceted. I was wanting to know about the perspective on art as a tool for maintaining culture. So I understand the contemporary art perspective, but also traditional arts for those who have been disappeared through the story that there are no more American Indians, and the way that American Indians are put into shadows by, like in the Southwest, if you have a Spanish name, you're being adopted as a Latino and divorced of your Native American identity. In the East, in the woodlands, you become part of the colored people, as you mentioned before. That's where that term developed. And so we have many so-called African Americans who are clearly physically part of Native American culture, who have been absorbed into the communities, et cetera. And so this emergence, I myself, my ex-wife passed, my late ex-wife, was Choctaw and Creek. And so my children, my grandchildren, I keep them advised of their history. My daughter's 45 now. When she was a kid, she was designing her own moccasin sneakers long before they were on the market as an idea. So the idea of keeping traditional art available as an identity tool and for a training tool. Contemporary comes, we have so many people who will actually be at the top of contemporary arts. So I think it's best to carry both, pursue both, and keep the ideas coming. And so I'm hoping that more is done in the future to really identify the living population in this country, because I really think that traditional, I want to say the original culture can settle this squabble where everybody has their little partisan thing. The bottom line is the landowner is right here, and everybody pretends that you don't exist. So there is no right without permission of the elders. Okay, so I just hope that we can go further with that and push both traditional and contemporary arts. Okay, so that's my statement. Other than that, you've answered all my questions just listening to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment, and it's never to suggest that contemporary displaces or somehow is opposed to the traditional forms of art making, and in fact a lot of contemporary artists do both. But I appreciate your comment. Thank you.
Anyone? Oh, yes.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a question. Is there some kind of recognition of the distinction between reservations and the reservation culture and the American Indians who live as urban Indians or displaced or suburban Indians? You know, is there something that's going on with the National Museum of the American Indian that kind of tries to balance its view about these things?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And you know, we have to put aside that the museum is actually hemispheric, because in reality we're always going to be mostly focused on the U.S. But in the U.S., so statistics would say most Indians do not live on reservations. They live in cities and other places, but it gets into, okay, so who's an Indian? And that's a whole snake pit of complexity and everything else. So in terms of the museum and its programming, it's trying to think about those things, but you know, I'll be candid and say reservation communities, federal recognized tribes, have a privileged place in that discussion. And the thing about Indians that's very important for Americans to know is that Indians are not just an ethnic group. They're the only group that has particular legal status. Right now it's called tribal sovereignty. That really does date back to the Constitution. It's not as clear-cut as some people say. It's not, you know, it's complex, but it is true. Even the most conservative members of the Supreme Court would say, yeah, there is something there that goes back to the beginning of the country, and Indians are, in that way, different than any other minority group in the country. So the focus on reservations is partly about the importance of them being maintained, because in general, Indian people, wherever they live, they want to be able to maintain themselves as Indian people as they define it. versus being just one other group in the United States. So there's a overemphasis on reservations, but I think there's a smart reason for that emphasis.
Are you aware that our mayor has a commission to review certain statues and whether they should remain, including statues of Christopher Columbus in New York City? Do you have any? Do you have any desire to comment on that?
I never could get that excited about Columbus. I don't know why. I know people. I know like young Indian people that get emotionally wrought thinking about Columbus. Man, it was really a long time ago, and he was just one guy. And if he hadn't come over here, somebody else would have 5 or 10 or 20 years. So I never care about that. I think in the museum business, we're not really about eliminating, artwork of any kind. But I will tell you this, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about the Confederate memorials in Tahlequah, the capital of the Cherokee Nation. I'm not quite sure why most people in this room would say there needs to be a reassessment about Confederate memorials, in Richmond or Charlottesville, and yet the Cherokee Nation gets a pass for, celebrating their generals who fought with the Confederacy till the very end. I think that should be a discussion as well. So I don't know. It's a teaching moment, I guess. I don't really believe in teaching moments. I don't know. But it's a very interesting discussion the country is having about that. And it's difficult, but I think it's amazing to have people. It's depressing and amazing that we're talking about the Civil War, all this time later. So depending on my mood each day, I think wow, that's so cool, or, oh my God, it's awful. Thanks, everybody.